Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 128, number 128, where we get some philosophy off the internet, read and review it live on air. Or, there's no air anymore. It's on some sort of weird wireless connection at some point, probably. But we're on wires. We're definitely on wires. Okay, so let's take a look at what some of the top... what we'll do, we'll look at the top, see if anything was released today. There was nothing yesterday, because it was all the same stuff. Say the 15th? Oh man, yeah, there's all the artificial intelligence as law. Okay, let's see if that's fun. AJP, take a look at them. Although they usually do not have short papers. Look at that, 1 to 26. No, thank you. That will take hours. One to 14, 1 to 16, grounding in the myth of ontological innocence. Let's see if there's anything I can. Well, a lot of this 1 to 15. Let's see what else we got. Fallibility for expressiveness 1 to 15. Let's see if we can get anything. Paradox of duties to oneself. What do I owe myself, eh? Let's see, anything else? 1 to 11. Well-being counterfactualist accounts of harm and benefit. The repeatability 1 to 5. Oh, reply, okay. I was like, they don't do, yeah, like, AJP does not do, short things. Except as a response paper. The Stoics on Lecta, all there is to say. Katya Maria Vogt. Alright, let's see if these are here. If they are, maybe. See how long they are. Well, this is interesting. We're going to have a few different options. Let's see how long these things are. $18 and teeny text. No, thank you. 20 and double spaced. That is much more workable. And this one, oh, this is an open access. Look at that. Let's see how it looks. Come on, PDF. $12. And teeny text. Let's do the this one here. Actually, what do I even know? Paradox of duties to oneself. Alright, whatevers. So this one, let's hit the download button. By Daniel Muñoz. I apologize for saying your name wrong. But if you come and wanna watch live, you can grab the paper by typing !paper in the chat box, and then this link will come up. But if you're not here right now, you won't see this because you tend not to see previous chat stuff. But you can recover the link. And it's cool, and I always enjoy it if someone sends me something to read or like suggests an author. Had one a few days ago of someone I had already read a paper by, actually a team of writers, and I read another one of their papers, and it was good as well, which is always nice. So I do take suggestions, and they are appreciated, because although I do like kind of just going on fill papers and just finding something, I've gone for like 10 minutes, can't find anything to read. It's like, no, I'm gonna be here all day just not even reading anything. Okay, so the paradox of duties to oneself, forthcoming in AJP. Introduction. Morality says. How does morality say anything? It's a word or it's a concept? I don't know. Morality says we owe each other plenty of things like minimal care and basic respect. Since others tend to be quite a bit like us, you might think we also owe a few things to ourselves. We owe each other plenty of things, saying morality and then us. But because of how we owe things to other people, we owe ourselves things? Maybe. There certainly is something gross about a servile suck-up, and something morally charged about a tragic suicide, even when the agents don't harm or demean anyone else. So you might think we have duties to ourselves. Duties to self are indeed intuitive, and they have enjoyed broad support throughout the history of ethics, but they are haunted by a paradox, conjured by Marcus Singer. For three apparent truisms, we can show that duties to oneself are incoherent. If A has a duty to B, then B has a right against or with respect to A. If B has a right against, or he or she can give it up and release A from the obligation. And 3. No one can release himself or herself from an obligation. Taken one by one, these all sound plausible. Well, I mean, you can just be like, if A has a duty to B and A is not equal to B, I mean, simple enough. Taken one by one, these all sound plausible. Taken together, they rule out duties to oneself. The paradox of duties to oneself is the key test for any theory of self-obligation. It is also a crossroads. You must choose. Will you sever the link between duties and rights, between rights and release, or will you allow for the power of release oneself from duties? Your decision here determines what kind of theory you end up with. I mean, or you could do what I just did and just technically define yourself out of the problem, and then you'd be like, I don't have a problem because I define myself out of it. Of course, that never solves anything. Despite its influence, the paradox has not received much systematic treatment, partly is because since Singer's time, duties to oneself have largely disappeared from the radar of academic philosophers. Another factor is Singer's critics are scattered across literatures, only a few develop their responses in depth or survey other options, most are happy to poke a hole in a premise. I critically survey the responses to Singer's paradox and argue for the possibility of self-release, attacking Singer's third premise. Although this premise is most widely accepted, Singer hardly supports it, beyond his claim that it is essential to obligations that one can't wiggle out. I consider two ways to develop this idea, one using deontic logic, one metanormative, and reject both, concluding that there could be bona fide waivable duties to oneself just as real duties to others. 6. I mean, personally, if you're going to use the word wiggle, like, wiggle, I'm sure there is some way to wiggle, and, wiggle out, yeah. I mean, I can guarantee you, if you say wiggle, there's going to be some wiggle room. There's always wiggle room. That's the whole point of wiggle. Before we begin, let me clarify the topic. When we talk about duties to people, we are talking about what is owed to them, not just what duties are held regarding them. If I promise you to water your petunias, I have a duty to you and merely regarding your plants. I telltale sign. If I forsake my duty, I don't wrong the plants, I wrong you. I don't know, maybe the plants will be angry with you. Now just about everyone agrees that we can have duties regarding ourselves. For example, I might promise you that I won't smoke this week, even in private. My new duty is self-regarding, concerning my own body, but not self-directed. I owe it to you not to smoke. Our topic is the possibility of owing bona fide duties to oneself. Well, you could also just go with the schizophrenic thing, saying, well, there's multiple selves, and then you could just get yourself out of all of these things. I mean, it's actually not as crazy as it sounds to say, look, there's one of these like soul and physical body distinctions, and then you could say, well, I owe my soul, like my conscious self owes my physical self something. So let's see. Duties without release. How can we get out of the paradox? One option, of course, is to accept the conclusion that there are no duties to oneself. But we could also contest a premise. That means 3 more options. We could 1, accept duties without rights, accept rights without powers of release, or 3, accept that people can release themselves from duties at least sometimes. Let's start with the most popular options, 1 and 2. Singer's first 2 premises link duties to rights and rights to release. The entailment from duties to rights is, on some views, guaranteed by definition. If I have a duty to you to not harm you, you have a correlative right against me that I not harm you. If you owe me $5, I have a right to $5 from you. Following Hofield, 1919, I was going to say 2019, 1919. Many philosophers take this to be part of the definition of a right in the strictest sense, also called a claim right. Other writers say that, by definition, the holder of a right can waive it, releasing the subject of corresponding duty. Well, yeah, if I owe you $5 and you say, hey, don't worry about it, then I don't owe you $5 no more. But Singer's critics don't stick to any single use of right, and so for us, the term might be more trouble than it is worth. It will be hard to separate those writers who reject one from those who reject two. To avoid verbal disputes, I propose we drop rights talk for now and focus on the substantive idea behind these two premises. If that X owes Y a duty, it follows that X can release Y can release X from that duty. Okay. How could we break the link between duties to self and powers of release? There are 4 options to choose from. First is the idea that duties to oneself aren't juridical or legal, like duties to keep promises and refrain from bodily harm. Juridical duties are external and enforceable. They concern our acts rather than our motives, and we can be coerced into complying. There's also a link between juridical duties and release. A wave of your hand can forgive a debt. A signed form lets the surgeon cut me open. But nothing can release us from our non-juridical duties. They just require right acts from good motives, a requirement that no one can dissolve. So Singer is right. The idea goes that duties to oneself can't be juridical. They could be non-juridical, but they could be non-juridical. We could have duties to ourselves in the sense that we have reasons to care about and respect ourselves for our own sakes. Well, what does our own sakes even mean there in that case? If you're gonna say that we have right to ourselves, then isn't this just sort of what is our own sake at that point? Unless you're just sort of reiterating the same fact that you have rights. Or duties to yourself. It's like you have duties to yourself because you have duties to yourself. What is it to be for your own sake in that case? I'm not even sure if you're going to make this distinction that you can use. I think it's just redundant. Sort of begging question a little bit. I mean, that's not like a problem. It's just there might be some sort of it's like a use mention almost problem. It's like, yeah, alright. This is the leading response to Singer by a mile. The problem is that non-juridical duties don't seem much like duties at all. The hallmark of duties and rights, as opposed to globs of values and normative reasons, is that they're fit to enforce by legitimate demands and external coercion. If you have a duty to pay me back, I demand the cash. If I have a duty not to harm you, you may preempt my punches by hitting first, if that's what it takes. Self-defense. But we can't enforce good behavior in general. Brushing teeth, donating a spare kidney, etc. And non-juridical duties, by definition, just ask for good behavior from nice motives. Non-juridical duties aren't even supposed to be enforceable. They're more like sources of moral advice, telling us what to value and why. We call this sort of thing a duty if we want, but that is a big concession to Singer, who would just insist that real duties are juridical. Yeah, so this is the semantic problem. You're just calling it something different and defining yourself out of the problem. A second response is also concessive. Some writers relax the idea that duties must be owed to oneself. For Knight, we have duties only to ideals. Some Kantians suggest that obligations are owed only among parts of people. No whole person, strictly speaking, owes any person anything, though we might loosely say that I have duties to myself when one part is obliged to another. There are those like Myland and Phocion. Ooh, Phocion. Interesting name. Phocion? Phocion. A retreat to the claim that we have self-regarding duties, like the utilitarian duty to cheer oneself up, owed to no one, or the duty to quit smoking as promised, owed to the promisee. Sometimes this retreat is hailed as a triumph. Oakley argues that we can release ourselves from merely self-regarding duties in a paper called Good News for Duties to Oneself. These authors do manage to defend something like a duty to oneself, but again, if this is the best response to the paradox, I think it's safe to say the paradox wins. Yeah, this is biting the bullet and just saying, well, the paradox is right, but we're doing something else that doesn't apply. So the question is, maybe that is the right answer. It's like, well, we're just sidestepping the paradox in that case. I mean, paradox doesn't win, it's just you have to you just have to avoid it in that case. The margin of victory is at its widest with the third response, which is that no one can release anyone from obligations. This is blatant overkill. This is an interesting response. You wonder, calling something overkill in philosophy is an interesting way to argue. It's just blatant overkill. I don't know. It's like you're going way off the deep end on something, and then if you go off the deep end in philosophy, sometimes you end up in an interesting spot. So sometimes this is the right move, but it's just depending on the situation you're in. You're like, well, you just can't do that, and answering why something is blatant overkill is quite often hard. You see, people release people from duties all the time. See, this is a reasonable sort of thing to say, but that doesn't make it the right thing to say. In the paper I was doing last night, they were saying, look, you can't. It was just an argument from induction. Just because people do stuff all the time, that doesn't make it the right thing to do. You can't, and just because it happens a lot doesn't mean it's inductively correct. What else could I be up to when I let you out of a promise, or when I sign my dentist consent form? I mean, well, maybe you're just wrong. Maybe this is not how things are. So this is an appeal to just sort of like reasonability, but there's very little to actually support this sort of argument. It's just, okay, we're not in that sort of metaphysical weirdness. We're talking about something else. But this is more of a, I guess you could say, a context argument. You're talking about something else right now. Okay. Finally, the most promising response in the literature. There might be contingent reasons why we are unable to release ourselves from certain duties, which could open up space for some contingently unavailable duties to oneself. The first to suggest this was Daniel Kading, who gives the following case. Suppose A promises B to do X after B's death. We should certainly want to say that although B, after his death, cannot possibly release A does continue to have an obligation to B. Not exactly gripping drama, but clear enough. Okay, this is philosophy. This is sort of unfair. Almost all of our examples are terrible stories. That's why I went and read some philosophy and literature papers. I was hoping to get some more gripping examples. Maybe I'll go back and find some more of that stuff. Sometimes you can't be released because the person to whom you are obliged can't do what's necessary to release you. Well, you're assuming you die when you did. There's no soul to release you. I mean, what's it called? Let's go look at Hamlet. Can't the ghost release the sun? In Kading's case, the source of incapacity is death. We could also imagine promisees who can't release anyone because they are napping, gagged, or off the grid. Singer has some subtle replies, but the real problem for Kading is that his case don't have anything to do with the traditional duties to oneself. Even if he does show that we can't be released from certain duties, these have little to do with the classic examples of self-obligation. It is not as if we can, post-mortem, break promises to our dead past selves. Nor is it this sort of thing that people have in mind when they say we owe it to ourselves to take care of our bodies and carry ourselves with dignity. That's interesting. I mean, you can think you owe yourself something when you're younger, and then when you're older realize that was a silly thing to want. And so you can break that promise because you realize that you no longer are the same person, maybe. And so in some sense, the old person is dead. But of course, that's not what people have in mind when they're talking about these sort of things that carry with you over the course of your life. But in some sense, you could say, well, I've graduated from understanding the world in those terms, and so I don't have to oblige by them anymore. I get that sense when people are just like, yes, stop telling me to stop smoking. I know it's bad for me. I don't care anymore. It's like you've given up on that sort of view of the world, and so you don't care that you're smoking anymore because, yes, you know it causes cancer. Yes, it's probably going to kill you, or at least kill you somewhat in the future. But you know what? You don't care because, for whatever reason. And far be it from me to tell anyone to that they should be smoking or anything. Don't take my word for it at all. But still, there is something to the consistency of the identity. Again, I mentioned this earlier. There may be more than one way to split yourself up, and so this may not be so far off the mark. Okay. There are some other contemporary authors who defend unwaivable duties to oneself, but only one has a worked out theory, and it is Paul Scofield. Forthcoming also. Scofield grants that waivable duties to oneself are impossible, but he thinks we might owe ourselves some unwaivable duties because we can't release ourselves when our acts affect our lives in the future. A person might owe a duty to herself by virtue of occupying a perspective sometime in the future of which interests and ends attach. And since she cannot in the present get a release from the future perspective that generated the duty, because the perspective is in the future, of course, it seems that the duty could actually bind in the way characteristic of genuine moral duties after all. my occupying. How would you know about the perspective in the future? How could you occupy perspective at sometime in the future? I don't understand what that means. Like this first sentence right here, like occupying a perspective sometime in the future. How can current self know what future perspective is going to be? That seems very weird. I mean, yeah. I hope my future self thinks current Noah is smart. I don't know that the stuff current Noah is doing is going to be seen that way by future Noah. So what is my... How could you have a future perspective now? Okay. His basic idea is that to release someone, I need to occupy the right perspective. Roughly, my perspective at a time consists of my wants, feelings, and interesting at the time. I can't release myself from my duties not to harm you because I can't take up your perspective. I have different ends and interests. For the same reason, Schofield thinks I can't now release myself from duties not to harm myself in the future because I can't now take up the perspective that I will occupy when the harm befalls me. Though I am the same person as my future self, our perspectives diverge, so I can't validly consent to future harms. Yeah, I don't understand how you can consent to things in the future. It's like, well, you can get yourself into trouble that will mess you up in the future. But in some sense, I mean, it's still your perspective now about the future harms. It's not the future person's self. It's like you don't want to be hurt in the future either, but it's your perspective now that matters. Alright, so maybe that's just a technical problem. It's not a big deal. Okay. The result is that we must treat our future selves like unwilling others. Well, yeah, see, this is the problem. I'm not really sure about that. If we smoke for pleasure now, we impose on ourselves a hefty future cost. If we rack up debt, we hamstring our future choices. Yeah, I'm starting to diverge from the intuitions here. These acts are wrong. They wrong us, ourselves, and it's possible because we can't take up our future perspectives to secure release. Yeah, you don't know if it's going to be worth it, that like temporary pleasure now, if in the future, especially if it's highly risky. Okay, that's fair. That you won't know if the payoff, the temporary payoff now is worth the future risk. Okay, Schofield's view is original and principled. There's a lot to like about it, and here, whenever someone's doing this, they're about to drop the hammer. But it seems to me too restrictive because it makes it wrong to harm ourselves in the future, even for our future greater good. Since it makes it wrong to harm ourselves in the future, even for our own future greater good. What? How do you, this, alright. Suppose I let my dentist sedate me and take out my crooked wisdom teeth. For a while, it will be unpleasant. I'll be immobile in the chair, unable to do anything, groggy and uncomfortable. But the procedure is safe. It will spare me even worse grief in the future. Clearly subjecting myself to the surgery isn't wrong. But Schofield's view seems to entail that it is. After all, when I agree to the operation, I can't release myself from the duty not to have my teeth damaged in the future. But the teeth aren't getting damaged, your mouth is getting fixed. I mean, it seems like weird. Indeed, it is unclear how I could have released the dentist from her duty not to harm me later, since I couldn't then have taken up the requisite perspective. I find this a little weird. Huh. Yeah, no. What happened here? Nice try, stop posting links. Oh, okay. Yeah, no spammers, please. I mean, if you need the link... Let me just post the link one more time if you were trying to get the link. But this is why we have artificial intelligent bots that know how to prevent spammers. Okay, so my question here is, it seems a little bit, my complaint with this area here is that the way you're defining your situation seems very dependent on how you define your situation, whether or not you're getting yourself in trouble under these schemes. Like, if you're getting yourself oral surgery and that's like a reason not to do harm, it's a question, well, is that really doing harm in some sense? How you're slicing up that sort of surgery. Well, yes, they're cutting into you, and that counts as a harm, or they're doing a medical procedure to save you untold medical problems. Is that a good and not a harm? So I'm a little worried about the how we're to understand the contingent things that are going on. Okay, so Schofield's view thus seems to forbid perfectly reasonable trade-offs across one's life. According to the view, just as I may not in general harm unwilling others for the greater good, even their own, I may not cause myself future harms or authorize others to do so, not even for my own good. So it's just everything, but can't, depending on how everything we do, like, except for saying very, very quietly. Now, even that, sitting is bad for you. Like, there's always a future harm. So I'm worried about the ad hocness. And maybe that is a problem with the Schofield's view. I don't know. The problem is especially acute as if Schofield seems to think perspectives may last only for a moment. If I can't validly consent to what happens to me tomorrow or in 30 seconds, my moral powers are rather feeble, and everyone will need to be very careful how they treat me. Summing up, we have seen 4 ways to allow for duties to oneself without release. Construe duties to oneself as non-juridical. Settle for duties that aren't strictly owed to oneself. Give up on the idea that anyone can release anyone from duties. Find contingent reasons why we might not be able to release ourselves. But all of these have their costs. 1, non-juridical duties are more like nudges than obligations. 2 is a Pyrrhic victory if we can only defend duties regarding oneself or are owed to one's parts. 3, people seem to release each other from duties all the time. And 4, 2 of the main views of unwaivable duties have trouble in accounting for the cases. Kading can't vindicate any normal duties to oneself, and Schofield generates duties where we ought to be scot-free. Alright, yeah. To be clear, I don't think we should close our minds to the possibility of unwaivable duties to ourselves. Schofield and Kading might not have their finger on the reason why certain duties are unwaivable. But consider this rough idea. Some duties, like duties not to kill, might not be waivable, at least not for trivial reasons, because they are too important. You don't wrong me if you flick my arm with my consent. But even if I consent, you wrong me if you kill or torture me for fun. Duties put limits on what you can do, even to willing patients. This seems to be like a plausible idea, even though I don't know how to derive it from any theory of rights and duties. Limits on what you can do, even to willing patients. Indeed, the idea is anathema to theories like Steiner's on which all duties are waivable. But if you have unwaivable duties to me, why couldn't you also have the same toward yourself? Aren't you also a willing patient of your own actions? Well, see, this is a weird thing. See, again with the sort of schizophrenic, I shouldn't use that term, the sort of the dual identity of yourself. You are a patient of yourself. So you've got like 2 versions of yourself in this sort of theory. And so the question then is there just some sort of shift going on in how you view yourself as not yourself? So you've got 2 people there, and does that make sense? Okay, this is an intriguing symmetry. Some duties to oneself, like the duty not to cause gross and pointless harms, might be the intrapersonal flip side of unwaivable duties to others. But the concept of an unwaivable duty, like that of an unwaivable right, is itself a bit mysterious. Why can't we waive them? If we want to show that certain duties to oneself aren't really paradoxical, we can't stop now. We either need a deeper rationale for unwaivable duties, think Schofield on perspectives, or else an argument for the possibility of self-release. Since I don't have a theory of unwaivability, let me turn my positive arguments for the possibility of waivable duties to oneself. The possibility of self-release. How could one release oneself from a genuine duty? Consider some examples. Suppose I drop out of a class midterm. While enrolled, I have an obligation to show up and participate. Once I sign the drop form, I seem to release myself. A second case, more controversial, is that I might promise myself to do something, like adopt a pet, and then release myself when I learn that it will be more onerous than I have expected. There isn't anything obviously paradoxical about this. I started out obliged, I end up free. And yet Singer thinks the very notion of self-release is self-contradictory. Why? Here's what he says. It is essential to the nature of an obligation that no one can release himself from an obligation by not wishing to perform it, or by deciding not to perform it, or indeed in any way whatsoever. In other words, no one can release himself from an obligation, just as no one can release himself from a promise. This isn't very persuasive. First, Singer draws an analogy with promises to oneself, which he assumes are paradoxical. But why should they be? The only problem he raises for self-promises is that they allow for self-release, which for all we have seen is perfectly possible. Singer's other point is that it is essential to the nature of an obligation that we can't release ourselves from one in any way whatsoever. There is something right about this. Obligations aren't optional like hobbies or fancies, and so we might think obligations must be inescapable. How to respond? I think we should take a cue from G.A. Cohen's critique of Hobbes, who makes the analogous point for a legal obligation. In Leviathan, Hobbes argues that a sovereign who can change the law isn't bound by the law. The sovereign of a commonwealth, be it an assembly or one man, is not subject to the civil laws. For having power to make and repeal laws, he may, when he please, free himself from the subjection, by repealing those laws that trouble him and making of new, and consequently he was free before, for he is free that can be free when he will. Cohen's response is that even the sovereign really is bound by those laws that trouble him until he repeals them. Yeah, so you have to do something. So after all, the sovereign has the authority to make laws, and the laws do in fact cover his actions. This is enough to make the sovereign legally bound, even though at will he could unbind himself. Cohen concludes, the big mistake in Hobbes' argument is the supposition that I can repeal the law, that if I can repeal the law, then it fails to bind me even when I have not yet repealed it. Hobbes is wrong that if you can free yourself at will, then you are already free, that he is free and can be free when he will. But other important things do follow from my being able to free myself at will. For example, I cannot complain about my unfreedom. And in a slogan, can get free doesn't mean free already. Yeah. The same goes, I think, for moral duties to oneself. Even if we can free ourselves, we are bound until we do so. As it turns out, this point has already been made in the literature on self-promising, where Rosati writes, we would not be tempted to say that because the promisee can release the promisor at will, the promisor is not really obliged. So long as the promisee has not released the promisor, she is indeed bound. But then we should say the same thing about self-promises. Although an agent as promisee can release herself as promisor at will, so long as she does not relieve herself, she is indeed bound. Alright, so you've got maybe some sort of speech act theory here where I now release myself. I propose extending this point to self-obligation in general. For example, I think we owe it to ourselves not to cause ourselves significant harm, even for others' good. But if we take the choice seriously and have relatively decent reasons, we can release ourselves from that obligation, making self-harm fine, where before we were bound not to do it. That is the core argument for self-release. There are intuitive examples. Alright, well, I'm sure they're going to go over stuff. There are intuitive examples, and although Singer thinks they don't make sense, we seem to have a coherent way to say how they work. Agents are bound until they free themselves. It helps to remember that this kind of thing happens with all kinds of states, not just being in the state of being obliged. I might be bound by ropes even though the slightest movement would make them fall off. A door might be locked even if it will automatically unlock should I try to go through it. The ropes bind me and the door locks me in until the moment when they normally kick in to constrain me. Again, this seems to be, as I was saying above, I'm a little worried about the ad hocness of how we're breaking down the situation. Now, I think I appreciate the point here. I think they might be right, but I'm worried about like the door that like unlocks when you go near it. Then it's like you're saying it's locked, but if anyone goes through it, it opens up automatically. Then what sense is it locked? It seems sort of arbitrary to say it's locked. If it has a latch on it, but the latch automatically releases when anyone's near it, it just is saying the door is closed at that point. Yeah, it seems a little weird to say that the door's locked in even though the door just opens for everybody. It's like, how is it locked then? I mean, you're talking about the technical like state of the latch, but the technical state of the latch doesn't really matter in that case because it just unlatches. Alright, so I might have semantic problems here, but that's okay. Could there be more to Singer's objection than I am giving him credit for? Isn't there something to the idea that we can't release ourselves from duties? We don't want to declare victory too early, so let's try to develop Singer's worry, first as a principle about the deontic logic, and second as a meta-normative claim about duties and reasons. We can start with the deontic logic, the logic of obligation and permission. McNamara 2018? I mean, this goes back to von Recht, like 1953, I believe. at least. Maybe late 40s. So who are you referencing? What, it doesn't really matter. It's probably just a textbook. Self-release, the logical objection. Singer's objection to self-release is that real obligations can't be shirked. I like this person. They used wiggle and now they're using shirk. As Hobbes puts it, he is free that can be free when he will. Is this a valid principle in deontic logic? If so, that would vindicate Singer's hunch. Oh, come on. You're going to argue that logic is designed by somebody, and the way they design it reflects their philosophical opinions. And so using the logic to justify a claim is just really arguing the author of the logic, or that principle that's being used in the logic, is more important than the claim itself. So the significance of the structure of the logic really depends on the philosophy underlying the logic, and I mean the fact that it has to have certain properties in the logic, but that only goes to the strength of the concept that was behind it. So I'm originally hesitant to endorse this sort of argumentation. Now, if the logic and the concept match up, then the concept does get to inherit all the power of the logic, which is great. But again, the endorsement of a concept by the fact that it coheres with some logic is only going to show that you think the logic is better than the philosophy behind that logic is better than the concept, which you can't assume. Okay, so is this a valid principle of deontic logic? If so, that would validate Singer's hunch. If not, and we can model counterexample, that would tell in favor of self-release. Yeah, not sure. Not my favorite argumentative style. Hobbes' dictum, as it turns out, has a natural translation into deontic logic. The S4 Axiom, diamond P, implies diamond P. Diamond means permissibly. Intuitively, the statement says, if P is permissible to make permissible, then it's permissible already. So if something is permissible to be permissible, then it was already permissible. But there are natural countermodels to S4 Axiom in standard deontic logic. First, a case of legal obligations. Suppose I'm allowed to petition the state for an exception to its no birthday cakes law. It's my birthday, I want cake. No birthday cakes, it's against the law. In the actual world, I don't petition and I don't bake anything. But I had the ability and the right to get an exception. If I had got one, I might still not have baked a cake, perfectly permissible. Or I might have gone ahead and baked one, permissible only given the exception. Here's a way to depict some of what's going on in these three possible worlds. If an arrow points from one world to another, then what goes on in the second is permissible by the laws as they are in the first. Alright, world 1. I don't petition and I don't bake a cake. Alright? So here, arrow points to one world, then goes on the second one. It's permissible by the laws as they are in the first. So in world 2, you do petition and you don't bake a cake. In world 3 is permissible on the permissibility of world 2. On the permissibility of world 1, I do petition and I do bake the cake. The key point, what goes on in world 3 is not permissible from the point of view of the laws as it was in world 1. No petition, no cakes allowed. And this is true even though W1's laws permit what happens in world 2, whose laws permit the cake baking of world 3. In world 1, it is legally permissible to make cake baking legally permissible, but it does not make it actually lawful. What about moral obligations? Suppose I'm Carol's neighbor and I'm asked permission to use her bike. If she complies waiving her rights, I'm morally permitted to ride it to work. We get the same structure as before. I don't get permission, I don't ride her bike. I do get permission, I don't ride her bike. I do get permission, and I do ride her bike. Riding the bike isn't permissible given my obligations as they are in World 4. But these obligations, this is World 4. But those obligations do permit me to ask permission, and if I do that, I am free to race off into the distance. My obligations change if I choose to ask permission. I conclude that there is a natural way to model self-release, leaving aside the nice details like the timing of release. We might be permitted to make an act permissible without it actually being permissible. Hobbes' dictum and Singer's hunch aren't logical truths. Okay, so this is a reiteration, in some sense, of what's going on up here, saying that at the time you are bound until you do something, and then when you do that, you can release yourself, because Yeah. So if you can bind yourself, but then you can also release yourself. But you are, until that time at which you release yourself, then you are still under obligation. And so that's what these are showing yourself. For in the general world, you're under obligation, and then even if you do something, you still that doesn't mean it happens. And then you get yourself permission, and then you do release yourself. But it takes effort at some point to get yourself out of the obligation, even to yourself. And so that positive effort is the argument here, and which is in some sense represented by the entailment. So the entailment is showing that there is some sort of positive effort that has to go in. Now, again, I don't like the argumentation here, but that at least illustrates their point nicely. Self-release and the meta-normative objection. He is free that can be free when he will. Isn't a logical truth? Well, again, use of logic. You could make it one. It might just be a very weird logic. Nor is Singer's version. No one can release himself from an obligation, but there is still something right about them. Think back to Hobbes' sovereign. Because he can change the laws at will, there is a sense in which they never restrain him. He never has to give up what he wants in order to follow the law. He can change the law instead. If the sovereign wants free sandwiches from the bakery, he may legislate the sovereign eats for free. If I want free sandwiches, I have to steal them. Now I want sandwiches. But if I have the power of self-release, then at least when it comes to duties to myself, I'm a bit like the sovereign, unrestrained. I never have to give up something I want in order to comply with a duty to myself. I can waive it and do as I please. Is there anything incoherent about norms that don't restrain us? The big worry, I think, is that such norms wouldn't give us any reason to comply with them. And normative reason is a fact that counts in favor of some way of acting, making it more choice-worthy. But the fact that I have a waivable duty doesn't guarantee a reason to comply. Yeah, that's fine. Even if the sovereign has some reason not to break the law, and the law forbids littering, the law doesn't give him any reason not to litter. It only counts against littering without changing the law. Similarly, if I have an easily waivable duty to myself not to guzzle poison, it's not automatically a reason against guzzling poison. It only counts against guzzling without waiving. Yeah, like just because you can change the law doesn't make it a good idea in some sense. Like, if the sovereign does too many things changing the law, then people will stop believing the sovereign's word, perhaps, and then it will be difficult for the sovereign to like if the sovereign's too erratic, then people won't take the sovereign seriously, and that might cause other problems. So perhaps the sovereign has the fact that it takes effort to change the law or change your obligations, that matters in some sense. And so just because you can waive something doesn't mean you should waive something. And so the fact that you have just general obligations, it counts to your being a sort of responsible person more generally, that you hold your word even to yourself. And so I guess going like Kantian, you don't break your own, it's bad to break your own word, just in general. Not Kantian maybe, but it's just it'd be a self-bad thing if you just consistently were inconsistent with your obligations to yourself. And so the effort taken to counteract that, in some sense, might be significant here. Alright, let's see what the author has to say. Is this possible? Could there be a duty without a reason to comply? Many say no. If I owe a duty to someone to do X, it must give me a reason to do X. This suggests a meta-normative spin on Singer's objection. If we could release ourselves from duties, we might not have reasons to comply, but it's essential to the nature of duty that we do have reasons to comply, so self-release is impossible. This is the best objection yet. It is not just mistaken like the logical objection, nor is it just a bare assertion like Singer's original point. There is a genuine tension between self-release and the idea that duties give reasons. But everyone can agree that duties usually give reasons. Why think they always do? Why couldn't there be principled exceptions? We've already seen some political exceptions, Hobbes' sovereign, Rossetti's self-promiser, but these are a bit complicated. None of them involve an ordinary duty owed by one person to another. So let's consider a simpler case, duties to accommodating others. Suppose I promise you freely in light of the relevant facts and with no nefarious intentions to ride home from the airport. Now, I owe you a ride, but suppose also that I know that you are keen to accommodate me. If I ask to be released from the promise, you will gladly let me off and find another way home. The result is a duty without a reason to comply. Even though I have an obligation to you to pick you up, that itself gives me no reason to do so, since I could just as well seek a release instead. My obligation only gives me a reason not to break the promise, not to bail on you without release, which means that if getting release is easy and painless, I am free to call you up and let you find another way home. The point generalizes. I might owe it to you to stay off your land, but that isn't a reason to stay off your land if I know you would gladly invite me in. I have a duty not to use your nice fountain pen, but that isn't a reason not to use it if I know you're if you are happy to lend it. Don't touch my pen. What's going on in these examples? Is there a principled reason to think that the duties involved aren't really reasons? The key, I think, is that these duties depend too much on my decisions. Whether they are in play depends on what I do. Do I seek release or just drive to the airport? But reasons can't be so decision dependent. A reason must be able to rationally persuade the agent into a way of acting. If it has force only given that agent is going to act that way, then it is persuasively powerless and can't really be a reason at all. Yeah, like you give people a ride to the airport because you're friends with them and you're doing it to be nice. But then it's like, and if you can't do it, then your friend will say, look, I understand, I'll get another way home. It's not a big deal. But you see there's the friendship thing in the background there. Because you, as in a famous Seinfeld episode, you just don't randomly give out rides to the airport, especially in New York, because it's painful here. I mean, I was visiting my uncle, and we get to the airport, like it's a little airport, and where he is, it's just outside of it's a reasonable sized city, but like the airport's outside town, and you literally walk down the what is it? Not the gangplank, the thing, whatever. You walk out, you grab your bags like right there, and you go outside, and like the parking lot is like across the street. Like there's like one like 2-lane like street, and like he's parked like just right there. Like if you're from New York, this is like mind blowing. He was like standing right there. Like you walk out off the plane, you grab your bags, and he's like right there, and it's like, let me make this clear for other people so they understand. New York airports have been famously maligned, even by politicians. I think it was Joe Biden that said they were like third world airports. They were getting complaints that it was taking so long to get the bags, and so they had to find a way. It was just terrible. Like you wait at JFK for your bags for who knows how long, and basically they found out that if they made more barriers so that it takes longer to get from the airplane to the baggage check, their complaints went away because it was taking so long to go from the plane to the baggage check that it gave the baggage handlers time to offload the baggage and get them on the carousel, and so that solved their problem. So that's a sort of like, that was a great solution that they found, that just give the people more hassle when walking, and then the baggage complaints stopped because the bags were more likely to be there when the people finally showed up. Okay, so the point is you have to actually be good friends with someone to drive them to the airport in this area in the Northeast. So there's something, it's not that like just driving someone to the airport is a significant thing here. So I don't know where this person is from, but like this is not a trivial example, at least not in, if you're going to JFK or LaGuardia or something, God forbid Newark, or I'm farther away from Newark, so yeah. So, sorry for that aside. In a slogan, reasons have to be stable over our decisions. Yeah, I mean, you have to have a friendship behind it. Otherwise, you're not driving anyone to the airport around here. You'd be like, you go get yourself a taxi. Thank you very much. Stability. If R is a reason for me not to phi, then R can't depend for its force on my not phiing. This kind of principle was first proposed by Thomas Nagel, has also found defenders in decision theory. Clearly, duties to accommodate others aren't stable. My duty to pick you up evaporates if I phone you and get released. The duty doesn't stay in force no matter how I fail to give you a ride. So stability says the duty isn't a reason to give the ride. No, but see, if you bail on your friends, then you're failing on other duties in friendship, is what I was trying to say. The same principle, I think, shows why I lack reasons to comply with waivable duties to myself. A waivable duty to not self-harm isn't a reason against the harm, because my decision to to harm entails my own consent, which waives the duty. Again, there is an intriguing symmetry between self and other. Earlier I suggested that unwaivable duties not to harm oneself might be the flip side of duties not to harm even consenting others. Now I'm arguing that waivable duties to oneself are like duties to accommodating others, unstable and therefore unable to give reasons. Alright. So they're unstable because your opinions are changing? I mean, it's like you're not being a friend to yourself, your future self, if you harm yourself now. But you can do that because they're unstable. Interesting. Okay, I conclude that Singer's objection doesn't work even in its strongest form. Waivable duties to self are metanormatively innocent. We lack reasons to obey them given their instability, but the same is true of other bona fide duties, like those owed to accommodating others. Conclusion. Duties to oneself are well embedded both in traditional moral philosophy and ordinary moral thinking, even the skeptical Singer admits. I have tried to defend our ordinary thoughts from Singer's paradox by arguing that we can coherently release ourselves from duties. My defense, however, leaves plenty to the imagination. We still have not seen details about what we owe ourselves, when a duty is waivable, or how exactly we release ourselves. My goal has not been to answer these questions or to develop any theory. I have just been clearing a path. Duties to oneself are possible, even defensible, but there is still much to learn about how they work and why they matter. In that spirit, let me close with 2 points about methodology. Let me write something down. This is the ad hoc. Got something to say. Alright, so I don't want to forget. I think I have something to say there. In that spirit, let me close with 2 points about methodology. First, duties to oneself are admittedly unusual in some respects, but we shouldn't be too quick to cry paradox. We should first try to understand what makes them unusual. We may find that we already have the elements of a satisfying explanation, as in the mystery of missing reasons. We lack reasons to comply with our waivable duties to ourselves, but that is because they are unstable. If we decide to act against them, we grant ourselves consent. This makes them a bit like duties to accommodating others. My second point is that we should keep an eye out for this sort of self-other symmetry. Duties to oneself can seem inexplicably odd if compared to typical duties to others, but the oddness here might turn on merely typical differences. Others don't typically consent to whatever we decide, know what we know, or want what we want, and so on. Once we start to hold these factors fixed, say by considering duties to accommodating others, duties to oneself may start looking less exceptional, more explicable than we had feared. I make these points because even if self-release makes sense, that is only the tip of the paradoxical iceberg. Shadowy questions float below. When we infringe duties to ourselves, do we owe compensation? Should we politely ask our own forgiveness? Most important, does it make sense to enforce a duty to oneself, say, with demands or threats? These questions are challenging, but they shouldn't scare us away from the whole topic of duties to oneself. We should be seeking answers just as we have sought solutions to Singer's paradox. Alright, this was fun. I like this the writing going on here. I mean, they used words, as I said, that you don't always see. You got like wiggle, and I forgot the other word I liked. Also, I mean, I like though I objected to the use of logic there, I actually like it when people do that. It does quite often help show what is going on in some sense in the background, but I thought that was actually an illegitimate use of it, but that doesn't mean it was bad. It was probably helpful to somebody else, just not me. I was like, why are you doing this? What I do want to say right here is, why, I mean, if you're going to have a duty to yourself and you break it, and you're saying, well, what's the cost of breaking it? In that sense, because if there's you can release yourself, but you're sort of under obligation until you do that, then the thought I just had was that if you're under an obligation until you break it, but of course you are always free to break an obligation to yourself because they're, as the author calls it, unstable. I'm not sure exactly what the stability is, but here's one way to cash out stability. Like I said earlier, current Noah always appreciates when past Noah did something smart and it worked out. Granted, that's quite rare. Yes, like usually it's just dumb luck. But when you start breaking your obligations, then at that point you are breaking the chance of actually doing anything and having it work out one way or the other. So when you do that, you are losing information about your reasoning ability. And so I go back to this sort of, I like it when things work out and when things are going well. So in some sense, to maintain an understanding of what's going on, you need to be consistent about the obligations you have. If you just break your obligations willy-nilly and there's no cost there, then you don't learn anything. You don't get any more information about how you were reasoning. And I'm sure there's more to, like, this is sort of a narrow point because it only goes to reasoning. I'm sure it's expandable if I thought more about it. But if I were to just, like, every time I made an obligation to myself and broke it, I would never actually gain any information about whether or not my decisions were correct or not. It's just like you put down a bet, but then you cancel all your bets. You can't win any bets if you just cancel all your bets. And so it's like you're losing that time, and you don't get that back. So there is a loss there in terms of if you just sort of ad hoc break your obligations whenever because you can, because you're the sovereign, you, in some sense, you don't gain the benefit of your reasoning in the past, and that would be a loss in that case. And so there is something to be lost on the rationality side, I guess you could say. You lose information about how your reasoning would go. Alright, so what else is there here? Yeah, and so there's a question about what the meaning of stability is that this author has. Now, for me, I would cash it out, at least in this little example of, well, the stability of my gaining information about my reasoning states. And did past Noah do something smart, and future Noah is appreciative of that, but if past Noah cancels all of the decisions that past Noah made, and there's nothing that current Noah can say about that because current Noah has no new information, just knows that the thing got canceled. I mean, maybe you could like say, well, this is how it would have worked out if I'd continued, but you can always do that anyway, and you don't always know what the outcomes are going to be. I mean, that's just sort of hindsight, but that's not a... You can learn stuff from hindsight, but that's not always how things go, because you make a decision, it changes things along the way, and then so it's hindsight doesn't always you don't know what would have happened if you had continued along the same path. You only kind of see what happened from a different perspective. Okay, so because these things are unstable, as the author says, you need a... well, no, you can break your own obligations to yourself because you don't have overarching strategies. Like I was saying in friendship, if you keep saying you're going to drive your friend to the airport and then you always back out, your friend might get angry with you and stop being your friend because you're an unreliable friend. And so that would be a stable obligation to others because you have some other obligation of friendship in the background. Now they're saying that obligations to yourself are unstable because you don't have these sort of second level obligations to yourself. I was saying rationality and the consistency of my rationality. I was trying to give one to say that's why I try to not just arbitrarily break my decisions. Now the question is, does that matter for do I have anything else to say specific about the argument here? So this meta-normative thing going on. I like the use of logic, but I don't like this particular use of logic, sorry. Not really obligated. Oh yeah, and then what was the arbitrary thing I said at the beginning? It was ad hoc, blatant over... Oh yeah, this... I think this is a question... I don't like this, this is... no one can release anyone from obligations. Yeah, well, that would make it metaphysical, that once it happens, it's like metaphysically necessary. And so that'd be a completely different argument. Well, let's just go back. You can't wiggle out. Well, again, I think, yeah, maybe that's part of the issue here. That if you can't wiggle out, that's making everything sort of on the same logical par, and so everything is the same. But there's definitely different values to different obligations, and so you can be more committed to different values and different obligations at different times. And so you, even though you may be obliged, you may have obligations to do X, if like obligation Y is more important than X, and Y is you can overrule X by doing Y. So that's a question of deontic logic. Why is everything first level? It's sort of, I was thinking of it in terms of logic. If everything's at the same level, all obligations are flat, then maybe there's something to that, but that might be something else to think about. And that's kind of what I was thinking. This setup here, by using variables in obligations, you're just treating them all exactly the same. And so maybe that there's a difference in kinds of obligation too, although that is basically pretty similar to some of the other things said here, that there are different kinds of obligations. Okay, I guess that's it then. Anybody have any questions? Let me know. Otherwise, that'll be it for now. Fun paper. You had some words I liked in it. Besides just the words I like wiggle. And I got to complain about New York City airports, which is a time-honored tradition here in New York. So have a good day. Stay safe, everybody. I'll be back, I guess, later today.